In Unit 8 on energy production, we're going to start to have a look at a little bit more at how some ideas in physics can affect society more specifically. And we're going to start with subtopic 8.1 on energy sources. So fairly straightforward beginning here. We're going to look specifically at sources of energy. And most of these you will have come across before and you'll be aware of what they are. But just want to sort of classify them a little bit first of all. And the two classifications that we're going to use, the first one is primary sources. You can understand that the second will be secondary sources, but we'll get to that a bit later. So primary sources, or a primary source, has not been converted or transformed before it's used by a consumer. So that means that we're taking the particular source of energy and converting it into a form that is directly being used by the user. And we'll summarise what all of these primary sources are a little bit later in this video, but that's the definition of a primary source. Now, a primary source can be broken into two subcategories, and again, terms that you're probably fairly familiar with. The first is a renewable source. And a renewable source, as the name suggests, is one that can be replaced or replenished. So sources that can be replenished over short time frames. And again, we'll summarise these in a table and talk a little bit more about some of these specific examples. So they can be replenished in short time frames. When we're talking relatively short time frames, we don't necessarily just mean a day or two. It could be sort of a year or a few years, but ultimately it's something that can be replaced relatively quickly. Another way to think of it is how quickly the fuel source can be replaced compared to how much is being used, or they can be or sources that are continually available. So things like solar and wind being examples that are continually available. So there's the definition then for renewable. The other type then is going to be non-renewable. And this word's probably needs a little bit of context, I suppose. By non-renewable, we're basically saying that they're sources that ultimately they can be replaced, but in timeframes that are a little bit too long for society, I suppose. So sources that can only be replenished over very long periods of time. And by long periods of time, what we really mean is that they're over long geological periods. So long periods in Earth's history, in other words. And great examples there being things like coal and oil. So they're things, fossil fuels in general, that take, in some cases, millions of years for them to form. So as I said, we'll just have a look at a brief summary of these types. I'll try and do this in a fairly neat and ordered fashion. Hopefully the size of the table will be appropriate first time. So we'll break it up into a few different ideas and categories about these types that we're looking at. So there's a few subcategories, and then we'll look at specifically what sort of falls into those categories. So to begin with, I'll just draw these lines so that I've got myself spaced out. So these are all the primary sources that we're interested in, and we're going to break them up into non-renewable and renewable. So they're the two main categories that we're going to look at. In the second column there, we're going to look at what the source of the energy is, and then in the last column, the specific energy type that's involved. Now, these are just examples to be aware of. You don't necessarily need to have all of this information well and truly stored in your head. Just need to be aware of the fact that we've got different types, the sources and the possible or the energy types that they correspond to. So the first one being nuclear fuel is an example of non-renewable. Once uranium-235 decays, it's pretty hard to replace it, and so the type of energy there is nuclear energy. The second type of non-renewable covers a wide range, and it's sort of one of the largest sources of our energy, being fossil fuels. So that's things like coal, oil and gas. And the form of energy that we're talking about there is chemical potential. So those are the two main sources of non-renewable energy that we use. If we now look at the renewables, we can group them into sort of 5 general categories. But the main one that we've seen for quite a while now is solar energy, or sources of energy coming from the sun. The type of energy that we're dealing there with is radiant energy, that we usually refer to as just being solar energy. Another source can be water. And there's a couple of different ways that water can be used. It could be tide, so tidal flow can be used to generate energy. Hydroelectric plants where water is sort of allowed to flow over a dam or a weir, so that it's the movement of water. Even things like water mills, where you've got, say, a stream flowing over a wheel that can turn the wheel. So the form of energy that we're really dealing with there is kinetic energy. So it's the motion of the water. In order to generate that kinetic energy, you usually need to start with gravitational potential, but ultimately it's the movement of the water itself that produces the energy. The next one is wind, so windmills, wind farms, those sorts of things. So again, another type of kinetic. Biomass is basically any organic matter that can sort of be burnt to produce energy. And that's another form of chemical potential. And finally, geothermal. So geo meaning earth, and thermal relating to heat. And so we'd call that it's a form of internal energy, and sort of think of that as being thermal, as in the movement of heat in those scenarios. So there's the primary sources of energy. The other type of energy that we need to be aware of, or the other source, is a secondary source. Now, secondary source, it's basically just results from the conversion of a primary source, or conversion or transformation. And so all of those sources that we've got above, all of those primary sources, they will ultimately be used to produce a different form of energy. So the most common one that we're familiar with would be electricity. So power plants take various forms, whether it's coal or nuclear fuel, converting that form of energy into electricity. And another one that's starting to become a little bit more prominent, a little bit more familiar, would be hydrogen fuel. So with hydrogen fuel, basically it's hydrogen will burn in oxygen to release energy. Water is also produced in that process, so it's a fairly low pollution or even no pollution source. The problem with hydrogen is that you actually need to use energy from a primary source to produce enough hydrogen. There isn't really enough hydrogen in our atmosphere, so you need to produce that hydrogen from hydrocarbons. So you need to use some primary energy sources to produce enough hydrogen fuel. So a little bit of a tricky one to deal with there. So they're the bare bones details of the sources of energy that we're going to be considering in this unit. The next video we'll start to look at some of the ways that we can identify which are going to provide us with certain amounts of energy and whether they're going to be useful or not.